and into the book of James. And we're going to begin chapter 4 this evening. James chapter 4. Not yet. Nope. He's got a very old system that is hard to find a part for, and it's got to be programmed and things. So yeah, keep praying for that. They got window units though going, so it's not nothing. Right? So not anymore. They put that on pause for now. So all right, James chapter 4. And if you got a handout, you can follow along. I tried to make it pretty simple and not too long tonight because I know it's hot and don't want you falling asleep or anything. But James chapter 4, and just want to encourage and be a help tonight. James 4, and we're going to read the first 10 verses and see what James gives to us tonight. So look with me at chapter 4 and verse number 1. He asks a question, and when I read that, I almost think it's a rhetorical question. And I'm sure we've all had those before where you weren't really asking for an answer. It was just getting you to think. And this is what he says in chapter 4 and verse number 1. From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence, even of your lusts, that war in your members? Verse 2, ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not. Verse 3 says, ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? But he giveth more grace. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hand, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness. Then he says in verse number 10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. We find here that James moves from, as we looked at last week, with our words, and how real words have real consequences. The things that we say, to now the conflict that goes on within or among each other, conflict within our relationships, our day-to-day world in which we live in. And that's why we find week number 8 is on real peace in a world of conflict. How do we have real peace in a world that's full of conflict? And you don't have to look too far to understand there's all kinds of conflict going on. Whether it's political, whether it's within a family, whether it's a war, or even church. All these things have conflict. And James really kind of guides us through the answer on why is there so much conflict? Why is there so many things happening? And we find this is incredibly relevant for the day and age in which we live, whether it's our workplace, whether it's just within our friendships, whether it's within our church or family or marriage or whatever it is, it can apply. And I want you to go back to verse number 1 where he begins, and notice that verse again. He says, from whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence, even of your lusts, that war in your members? Now, what James is doing is James is pointing out all the conflict going on around us and even within us. And I'm sure, like you have wondered at times, well, why are all these things happening? Right? Sometimes we wonder why all these bad things come about. Right? Why do people go through this? Why does this happen? Why are we going through that. And we find that James gives us some insight here to that very question tonight. So notice with me on your outline, we find this. Number one, he tells us the real battle is within. The real battle is within. That's where it starts. And James doesn't begin by blaming other people. He asks this rhetorical question that he's going to answer right afterwards, really asking, where do these things come from? Where are these things coming from? And what James does is he points us inward before he points us outward. So why are all these things happening? Why is there so much conflict? Why is there no peace? And we find, he says, it starts within before it starts without. You know, sometimes our world has a way of thinking if we just stopped going to war, we'd have peace. Right? If everything was just better in life, we'd have peace. If gas prices were down, if grocery prices were down, if this, and we could play that what-if game, but we find that James is saying it's not what's going on around us or on the outside. He says it starts on the inside. And we find the truth that many conflicts begin because of some different things. We find first selfish desires. A lot of conflicts begin because of selfish desires, James says. Because of, if we're honest, because of us. And what we desire is selfish, the Bible tells us. Secondly, it begins because of pride. Conflicts can begin because of people's pride. Thirdly, some conflicts begin because of jealousy. Jealousy over something. We find, fourthly, anger. Anger has caused many conflicts in our world today. And then even this one, many conflicts begin because of wanting our own way. Right? If we don't get our way, if they don't do it the way we want them to do it, if it's not done like we like it done, conflicts start. And many times we ask who started it rather than what James is telling us to ask, which is what's happening in our heart. What's going on? Don't look at the thing on the outside and say, that's why I did that. But he says, take a look on the inside and truly ask yourself, what's going on in your heart? Why you don't have peace? We find tonight that the greatest battles around us often begin with the battles within us. The greatest battles around us often begin with battles within us. And so James says, number one, the real battle starts within. Secondly, he tells us that selfish desires lead to broken relationships. Selfish desires lead to broken relationships. Verses 2 and 3 tell us that. Think about it. When life becomes centered on me, you know, they have the me syndrome or the I syndrome. It's all about me. What do I get? What makes me happy? What pleases me? What's beneficial to me? And that's not a good place to be. So when life becomes that way, centered on me, you know what happens? Conflict usually follows after that. Conflict usually follows after that. You know, that's in many different areas. We could think about areas that applies. When I get so self-centered or it becomes about me, conflict happens. And we find things like marriage disagreements can happen. Family tension can happen. Church conflict even can happen when life starts to be about one specific person, or we all look at it as, oh, it's about me. We could say even workplace arguments. Right? And so we find that many battles aren't caused by a lack of information. It's not that we just don't know or we don't have enough information. It's that they're caused most often by selfishness. Because when we truly look at the fact of the matter, why are there so many battles and wars, and I'm not talking about physically, but spiritually speaking, or conflict or discord or division, is usually because of selfishness. We must understand that real Christianity seeks peace instead of always insisting on its own pride. But real Christianity, they seek peace. What peace? The peace of God, instead of always insisting on its own pride. In other words, real Christianity isn't about us. It's not about what we get. It's not about what makes us happy. It's not what about benefits us. It's about the Lord. And we find that, as Mom and Dad probably used to tell us, the world doesn't revolve around us. Right? They've probably said that a time or two. They probably said life isn't fair. Right? And we find that that's the truth tonight, that the world doesn't revolve around us. It's not about us. It's about the Lord. And so we find that selfish desires lead to broken relationships. And that can be in all different areas. A workplace friendship, maybe with a boss, or within your marriage, or within your family, a kid to their parents, or a parent to their children, whatever the case might be. But then we find this, number 3. Not only do selfish desires lead to broken relationships, but God gives us good news here in number 3, and He gives grace to the humble. He gives grace to the humble. Notice verse number 6. He says, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. You know, there's a big difference between what pride says and what humility says. And if we're not careful, even within our Christianity, our serving of the Lord, even Christians can become very prideful in their aspect of, look how I serve, right? Look what I do. Look at who I am. Look at how my family is. Look at how I got it all together. And we find pride says things like, oh, I'm always right. Right? Pride says they need to change. They're the ones that got the issues. They're the ones that have the problems. They need to change. You know, pride says things like, oh, I don't need help. You know, part of that can be pride if we really do need help, to ask for help. But pride says, oh, I don't need any help. I don't need someone to tell me what to do. It's like people today saying, oh, I don't need a boss. I don't need someone in authority over me. And, you know, sometimes as young people we think that no one's going to tell me what to do when I turn 18 and become an adult and on my own. And that might be a shock, but that's never going to happen. You're going to go to work and you're going to have a boss. You might go to college and you have teachers and principals and president and all this. Someone's always going to be over you, right? We're always going to have some type of authority. But that's what pride says. But then think about the opposite. What does humility say? Humility says things like, Lord, search me. David said it in Psalms 51, where he said, search me, O God, and see if there be any wicked way in me. I mean, that's not a prideful thing, or a proud thing. That's a very humble thing. For you to look towards heaven as David did and basically say, God, I don't have it all together. I still have failures and mistakes and areas where I mess up and do wrong. Would you search me and find those that I could be better? Right? Humility says, Lord, search me. Humility says, show me where I need to grow. That's a big one. Sometimes within Christianity, people think they get to a certain point where they say, oh, I made it. Right? There's nothing else to learn. I don't need to grow anymore. I don't need to get better. There's nothing more I need to do. And it's just kind of like they think they get to a point where they've attained something, and then it's just kind of maintaining from then. Well, the truth is we never maintain. Right? They say if you're not growing, you're dying. If you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards. And that's true with everything. Right? That's true with planning stuff. That's true with our bodies. If we're not growing, unfortunately, we're dying. That's true with anything in life. And so we find that humility says, show me where I need to grow. In other words, I know I have areas where I fall short. I know there's things in my life where I'm not where I should be. And you ask the Lord for help. You know, humility says, help me respond like Christ. Help me to respond like Christ. Because sometimes it's easy to act like Christ in certain areas, but then when something happens, then our reaction isn't very Christ-like. Somebody says something, somebody does something. Whatever happens, and our reaction is a big thing. The world wants to see how our reaction is. Not when things are going right, but oftentimes when things are not going very well. When your boss yells at you for something you didn't do. When somebody makes a snarky comment that you didn't expect. And we find that humility says, help me to respond like Christ did. You know, I think about this. As Christ went through his ministry here on this earth, he was despised and rejected and persecuted and humiliated. And do you realize he never once strove to get the payback or revenge that he was worthy of? Matter of fact, on the cross, do you remember as he was dying, he said what? Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, if somebody says something to us, you know what we do? We're going to snap back at them. Oh, we're going to say something. They're not going to get away with that. And that might just be one simple comment. And we go off on them. But yet Christ went through his entire life, betrayed, and all these things, and yet he never once worried about getting the revenge. And so we find that's what humility says. Do you realize the strongest Christian is not the loudest? The strongest Christian is the humblest. Or you could say the most humble. It's not the one who's shouting and yelling the gospel and shouting as loud as they can and singing as loud as they can. That doesn't make them the strongest Christian. No, it's the one that is the most humble. We understand Proverbs tells us about pride. Pride goeth before destruction. And we find the strongest Christian is the one that knows they don't have all the answers. The strongest Christian is the one that knows that they're not always right. Now again, that goes against our pride. We like to be right. We like to say, I told you so. But humility says we're not always right. You know, I heard a preacher that used to say often, everyone knows something I don't know, therefore everyone is my teacher. In other words, everybody in our world today, there's things about people that they can teach you things because we don't know everything. Right? There's things that we can learn. Now, sometimes they might be what we would call a good example of a bad example, but you can still learn something from them. Oh, don't do it this way. Don't be like that. Don't respond this way. Don't do it like they did it. And it can help you really avoid some mistakes on your own. And we find that we always have something to learn. In other words, we always need to be a student, if you will. Learning the Bible, learning what God wants us to, because we'll never reach a point until we get to heaven where we've made it. We've crossed that bridge. Oh, I read my Bible all the way through one time, so I'm good. I know everything. No, it's amazing you read the same thing over and over again, year after year, and you can get so many different things from it. Why? Because the Bible is what we call inexhaustible. You can't exhaust the book. You know, sometimes this is the way I am. Anytime you ever watch let's say a movie, right? You watch the movie and then it gets over. And I never like watching the same movie over again because I already know what happens, right? I already know what happened. I don't need to know. Now, the truth is, if you watch it, you're going to catch some things that you probably didn't before. And sometimes when you think about it, it's amazing. I put it this way. Have you ever went back to old cartoons or TV shows that you used to watch, and then you've watched them today, and you say, wow, I didn't realize that, whether that was bad or good. And we find that's how the Bible is. Just because I've read it once doesn't mean I know it all. And we always have something to learn. Number 3, God gives grace to the humble. But then look with me at number 4. We find that peace, because if we think about it, this world is searching for peace. There's a reason Revelation talks about the Antichrist. What is he going to bring? He's going to bring a false one, but he's going to bring peace. Because that's what the world is searching for. Now that peace only comes with salvation. We understand that, the peace of God, which gives us the salvation. But it begins with submission to God. Peace does. Peace begins with submission to God. Look at verse number 7 and 8. He gives us several commands here on how to have the peace of God. First, he says, submit yourselves to God. Submit yourselves to God. What does that mean? That means to say, God, here am I. I give myself to you. Everything in my life is yours. Lord, use it as you please. Submit yourselves to God. Number 2, he says to resist the devil. Resist the devil. Number 3, he tells us to draw nigh to God. That means draw close. Desire to get as close to him as you possibly can. Draw nigh to God. And then we find he says, cleanse your hands. Tells us to cleanse your hands. And then lastly, to purify your hearts. Those are the commands that he gives us. Now notice the order. Victory doesn't begin with resisting the devil. Sometimes we skip that very first part. And we think, if I just resist the devil, I can overcome. I can get through it. I can get the victory over this sin or this temptation or this problem in my life. And we forget that very first part about submitting ourselves to God. When God says that is the first step, and then you can resist the devil. And sometimes we go through life and say, it's just not working. I'm trying to overcome. I'm trying to get rid of this sin. I'm trying to stop falling in this temptation, and it's not working. But the key is you're saying, I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to resist. But it's not about us resisting. It's about submitting ourselves to God and God helping us to get through it. Then after that, he says, draw close to God. Because the closer you get to God, the farther away from sin you'll get. As you draw closer to God, sin's going to become farther. And so if you want to stay away from sin more, you know what you do? You draw closer to God more. It's that simple. Then he tells us to cleanse our hands and purify our hearts. But notice it begins with submitting to God. And the closer that we draw to Christ, the more he begins to change our heart. The more he changes our hearts. And so if we want to have a changed life, right? If we want to have peace, what does he tell us to do? The Bible tells us to follow these steps. If we want that peace, we have to do what God says. And he gives us those 5 things on how to have peace with God. And then we find this, number 5. We find that God lifts up the humble. God lifts up the humble. Not only does he give grace to the humble, but the Bible says he lifts up the humble. Verse number 10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Now think about what our world says. You know what our world says? Promote yourself. Right? It says go out there, promote yourself, plaster yourself everywhere. Go live your life, be who you want to be, do your thing, follow your heart, all those different sayings that they got out in the world. But that's what the world says, to promote yourself. But what does God say? God says to humble yourself. So instead of saying, look at me, look what I can do, look at my talents, look at how famous I am, look what I've done, the Bible tells us to do the exact opposite and humble yourself. You know, I've noticed something when you build someone up or you put them on a pedestal, you know what usually happens? God knocks them down from it. When you think, oh, that person's so perfect, that person's got it all together, and all these things, a lot of times God knocks them down. You realize they're not all that perfect. You realize they still have mistakes, and they still don't have everything together. And we find that sometimes, even if we're not careful, we get, as what they used to say, too big for our britches. right? And sometimes we have to be knocked down a little bit to get us to realize that we're not all that we think we are. And so we find that our world says promote yourself, but God says humble yourself. And so and this is an oxymoron, the way up in God's kingdom is really the way down, is always down. Isn't it interesting how you'll read through the Bible and you'll see things like people getting on their knees before the Lord, bowing down before the Lord. Why? It's a sign of humility. We'll find that even as we think about when Jesus was talking to his disciples and they were arguing who's the greatest. Isn't it interesting that Jesus said the least of these, or the last, is going to be, the first shall be last and the last shall be first? Why? Because we find that the way up in God's kingdom is always the way down. And we find that God honors those who walk in humility. In other words, those who walk in their Christian life knowing I have things to learn, I'm not perfect, I'm trying my best, I'm growing, I'm learning, I'm striving to get better and better each and every day. So we can ask ourselves things like, in our life, do we create peace or do we create conflict? Does pride affect my relationships? Have I been quick to blame others instead of examining my own heart? Right, we're quick to justify, oh, this person did this, or it was because of that, or you didn't realize what happened, or do we just examine our own heart? Right, if we focus on ourselves getting better and more like Christ each and every day, we're not going to have enough time to focus on anybody else because we got a whole lot of problems that we're trying to deal with. And we find, are we submitted to God? That's really the biggest thing. If you want to be humble in your Christian walk, you have to stay submitted to the Lord. Because when you stop submitting to the Lord, that's when pride starts to take over. There's a reason John 3 in verse number 30 says he must increase, but he doesn't put a period. He says, but I must decrease. Why? Because you can't have pride and humility at the same time in the same cup or jar. It just doesn't work that way. So for Christ to increase in my life, I have to decrease. Now, we don't like that, right? We like to be proud and boastful and all those things, but Jesus says, if you want more of me, there's got to be less of you. There's a reason Paul in the Gospels, he talked about how he has to spiritually die daily, if you will. He has to crucify the flesh. Why? Because the flesh gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to do what I want to do today. The flesh gets up in the morning and says, what makes me happy today? What's going to please me? What's going to bring me joy today? But Paul says, I gotta stop that. I got to put that to death and allow Christ to control me or be submitted to the Lord. Do you realize, and we're finished in our closing thought, many people pray, Lord, change them. Right? Lord, would you just make them who they're supposed to be? Change their heart. Very few do as James challenges us to pray, and that's, Lord, change me. Right? We're quick to point out the other person and their flaws and their weaknesses and their mistakes and saying they need to get better, they need to change, they need help. But very few times are we saying, Lord, why don't you change me? And we find that real peace can finally begin in our life when God begins to change our heart. Not their heart. Because if God changes their heart and we think peace is going to come from that, there's going to be somebody else that comes across. And all we're going to be doing is going one by one by one. Lord, change the entire world. Because everything's wrong with them, nothing's wrong with me, right? Is how many people view it. You know, sometimes if you go through a conflict or something's happening, sometimes you'll look at someone and sometimes you ask the question, is it really them or is it really you? Right? And that's really what he's trying to say. Don't focus on everybody else around us, changing them, making them better, but focus on ourselves and ask the Lord to change us. Notice verse number 6 again, and we're finished. The whole point he's trying to get across to us. He says, but he giveth more grace. That's because we need it when we fall short. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. You know, when you look at the first couple verses and he talks about prayer, and he says things like, we want, but we don't get, we kill, but then we desire to have because we're never content. But he says things like, ye have not because ye ask not. You know, sometimes we're just too proud to ask God for something. That's the truth, right? We're too proud to ask God for help. I tell you all the time, I don't like to ask for help. And that might be fine with somebody here on this side of eternity, but if I need help from the Lord and I don't ask Him, it's a sense of pride. And so he says, ye have not because ye ask not, but then he also says this, ye ask and receive not because ye ask amiss. What does that mean? You're asking wrongly or for the wrong reasons. Because he says that ye may consume it upon your lusts. So James is telling us what? The difference between humility and pride. Right? And we find out that if we want real peace, true peace that people don't even understand what real peace is. People think, oh, if I just had more money, there'd be more peace in my life. If all my family members were just like me, there'd be a whole lot of peace. They did things the way I wanted them to do. If it was perfect, right, there'd just be peace. Right, we face these things. I'm the type of person, I'm a perfectionist. It has to be done perfect, or it bothers me. And if somebody doesn't do it the way I would do it, I think it's wrong. But that's not the truth. Or that's not the way it's supposed to be. And we find that James is trying to tell us that even in a world full of chaos and conflict and wars and arguments and division and discord everywhere, a true Christian can still have peace in their life. You know, that makes all the difference in the world. There's some Christians you can look at and they go through anything and everything and yet they have peace. And you wonder, how is that? Because they got the peace of God. There's a reason it says that passeth all understanding. Because we don't understand how someone can have peace when there's so much going on. Right? That doesn't make sense. Well, because we're looking at peace the wrong way. Peace doesn't come from without, peace comes from within. Our happenings, think about it like this. And I heard a preacher use this illustration before. The difference between happiness and joy. Right? Happiness comes from the same word as happenings. In other words, my happiness is dictated on what is happening around me. Right? And that's so many different things. But if we have joy, joy comes from the Lord, and so that's why we can keep our joy that it may be full even in times of conflict, even in times of trouble and despair and tribulation and all those things. So James gives us here in just these handful of verses how we can have real peace in a world that's full of conflict. The world's not going to understand it, and they never will until they truly know the Lord. But if we know the Lord tonight, we can have true peace, the Bible tells us. And we do it by following those 5 things that He gives us. We see real peace in a world of conflict. Let's pray together. Father, we thank You for this truth. I pray that it was a help. I pray that it was a